This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and I'm with Paul Follows, who's not only the leader of Waverley Borough Council, but also the Liberal Democrat candidate in what we now know to be the general election on July the 4th. Paul, welcome to the Guildford Dragon again.
Good afternoon, Martin. Thank you for having me.
And so I interviewed Jeremy Hunt a few weeks ago, and afterwards I contacted you and said I'd like to interview you as well. But of course, all that was arranged before the announcement of the general election, just so that our readers know what the situation is. And this is not I'd like to conduct interviews with local candidates, but this is not such an interview. This is an interview to allow your response to what Jeremy Hunt said in his. So first of all, I talked to Jeremy Hunt about, I know that he felt he was quoted out of context, but he was quoted as saying that £100,000 was not a huge salary for people in southwest Surrey. Now, the median salary for a full-time worker last year in Surrey was £42,000. And I just wondered what your view was of that.
So in the first instance, £100,000 is, a salary that is only earned by about 4% of the population of the United Kingdom in general. So it's a lot of money. And I think the underlying point is each pound goes a lot less far than it used to. So whether you're earning £100,000 or £20,000, that money's not going to pay for as much as it used to. And I think the point he was trying to make is that even if you're on £100,000, you're going to be struggling. And in many respects, I actually do agree with him in that there are going to be things that you can't afford at any price. So, for example, nursery provision at the moment is not just expensive, but it's difficult to get to and get access to. And that's actually due to another issue that I'll come to in a minute, which is about the availability of labour in general. But the point, I think, just shows how out of touch he is. Yes, I imagine somebody on £100,000 or thereabout that a year is going to be struggling in ways that they weren't before. And we can, in many regards, thank his government for that. But if somebody on that kind of money is struggling, well, how is somebody on £20,000 or £30,000 doing? How are they managing to get access to these services? How are they managing to cope with it? And they're coping with it through things like food banks. So from my point of view, yes, I accept there are going to be some areas where people on that kind of salary are going to be struggling, but it really does just show how little he understands what most people are actually going through.
So what ideas do you have for helping to improve the lot of people that can't even aspire to £100,000?
Well, there's several things we want to do. And one of the things we've been looking at in the local government realm is just about taxation reform. And these are things that we need government to take seriously. So I'll take as an example, somebody living in a £17 million house on Band H is only going to be paying something like £1,000 more a year in council tax than somebody living in a Band B flat somewhere. So there is clearly a lot of scope for people to be paying more council tax at the top end, whether that's creating more bands, whether that's expanding how much people are paying. But at the end of the day, if you're in a £17 million house, you can probably afford to pay more. And so, for example, I would massively expand the number of tax bands. Many of the things in this country that we're told we can't afford are in fact because people don't want to talk about the pretty deeply unsexy topic of taxation reform. They don't want to touch it. Business rates reform, council tax reform, general income tax reform, all of these areas, you've got loads of loopholes that need to be dealt with, and you've just got a deeply inadequate, ineffectual and unfair system. There is money in the country. It is just not being used in the right way.
Okay, now your party, going back some years, you may not remember, but I think your party at one stage was a fan of local income tax. Would you still think that should be considered?
Well, at the moment, I think actually just a general proper look at taxation across this country needs to be done. Whether it ends up being a local income tax or anything like that, I think is probably the next stage of this. I think at the moment, the country just needs to accept that the current system is not working and no amount of tinkering around the outsides is going to fix that. And we need some just general reform of how that works. My concern with people like Jeremy is, of course, that not only has he only pledged to look at the current systems, well, actually, he hasn't done any of the things that he's talked about. So as long as I've been an elected person, there's been every single year talking about local government funding reform, and every single year it gets pushed down the road. I think I've heard business rates reform come out of the Chancellor's mouth about 500 times over the last 5 years. It has never actually happened. People think that local councils set things like the rates and rents for businesses in high streets. The rents are set by the landlords. The rates are set by the government. I mean, boroughs like Waverley and Guildford only get to keep about 4p in the pound. The rest is whizzing off to the county and to the treasury directly in central government. And he needs to actually step up and recognise he hasn't even done the minimal things he's spoken about. But
Right.
even those are nowhere near enough to deal with the actual issues in this country.
And there's a lot of ignorance, understandably, amongst the general population of how the taxation works, isn't there? So, I mean, it's not, in some countries, it's much simpler. You know, when you buy something, for instance, there's a percentage or the whole amount goes to local government, and the national government taxation is separate. Would you be a fan of separating them out like that?
At the moment, I would just be a fan of the country taking seriously that it needs to be reformed. I do think the whole of business rates, income tax, local council tax, all of these things need dealing with, because at the moment they are both unfair and insufficient to deal with the problems that we have. The burden is hitting the wrong people in the wrong places. The people that can pay the most aren't paying anywhere near that. And people who are at the bottom are being squeezed the most. And to be quite honest, that is why people at every salary rate are finding things a bit more of a struggle than they used to, because the pound just doesn't go as far as it used to.
And
And Jeremy has to shoulder some of the burden for that.
do you think it also makes accountability more difficult because people don't know who's responsible for which area of taxation?
Absolutely. I mean, I spend a decent amount of my time quite reasonably, and to be quite honest, I don't know why anybody in any elected office should expect a resident to know every single thing about how local or national government works. But when you have town parish councils, borough councils, county councils, and the national government, most people just see, at the very least, the government and the council. And people don't get, quite reasonably, how all of that works. And in most cases, most of the things that local government are having to do is because they either don't have the legal powers to do what we think we need to do, or we just simply aren't getting enough money from central government to do the job. So, for example, let's talk about car parks. Many people would, quite rightly, I think, ask us to make car parks as minimal charge as possible, because obviously that would support local business, which in many cases councils would love to do. But when they're getting 4p in the pound in business rates, that is not enough money for us to actually not to maintain the car parks that we have. But local councils are reliant upon significant amounts of that car park to supplement the
Yeah.
income for the council to run services, because there's just not enough.
Yeah, I know
So
that
we're having to make those kind of decisions for
Yeah,
that very, very distinct reason.
in Guildford, I think car parking income is the biggest earner. So I suspect it's similar in Waverley. I don't know exactly there.
Slightly different proportions, but very
Yeah.
similar issue.
Okay. Now I'd like to move on to development within the area, because I pick up from the readers' comments, a lot of people are concerned with the amount of development. Some are concerned more with the lack of infrastructure to support that development, but also some are worried about the change of character that all this development brings to the area that they've chosen to live in. What is the right level of development for this area of Surrey?
I think the thing I'd just say first is this is another one of those areas where people get very confused about who does what. So although local councils like Guildford and Waverley have to determine in planning applications, we have to do so in a framework set exclusively by national government. And there are lots of times where those of us in local government, we don't like how those rules work, but we get penalised when we flout them or disagree with them. So in terms of development, I mean, I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people on doorsteps, certainly over the last few months, but over the last few years even more so. And I can categorically tell you that most people aren't against development in general. I mean, there are obviously going to be some people in some places who are against particular developments or the design and character of a particular scheme. But again, in terms of, do you support there being more housing? Most people are not against that. What they want is affordable housing that people in the local area have actual access to. I mean, most people I speak to at the moment have got, they've got children or grandchildren who can't afford a house in the local area. So they get that there needs to be more housing. But having 5-bedroom estates out in the Surrey Hills is not something that people are going to be picking up and affording very quickly. And the second point, as you very correctly indicated, is lack of infrastructure. And the rules at the moment mean that developers get away with putting almost no infrastructure in. And they're also allowed to balance the needs of affordable and social housing against that infrastructure, off against each other. And so often you get one or the other, or not enough of either in many schemes that go through at the moment. My bigger issue, though, is actually the fact that a lot of the schemes aren't built. at all. A lot of land banking going on. I mean, don't get me wrong, inflation might have gone down a little bit in some areas, but it doesn't mean prices are falling. And certainly for building supplies and things like that, that is why we're not getting a lot of the developments that have passed being developed. They land bank, the rules allow them then to get more planning permission elsewhere. And going back to the issue we were talking about raising revenue in a reasonable way, one of the things I would love to do is charge council tax on unbuilt properties by developers so that they actually were forced to finish off the developments they actually had permission for. Waverley's got something like 4,500 unbuilt units in our part of the world. And honestly, we need more affordable housing with proper infrastructure, not just housing. And then I get Jeremy Hunt wading in saying we need a national park in the Surrey Hills, which would massively increase the house prices and make it even more unaffordable. And this is an area where, of course, not only is he talking about a national park, but he's also aiding and abetting fracking and things like that. So, I mean, it's all completely convoluted. And I understand why residents get upset.
But do you agree with him that you should be pro-development in as much as he was saying that, well, I'm paraphrasing, but I think he was saying we can't just leave things as they are. There has to be some development.
I don't think anybody here is saying that there shouldn't be some development. What I'm saying is there should be the right development with the right infrastructure. And honestly, some of the very first meetings I ever had with both Jeremy Hunt and Angela Richardson was basically saying, look at your own government's planning policy. Look at why these houses aren't being built. Look at why they haven't got the right infrastructure. I mean, I think in a minute you said we were going to talk about Thames Water, but there's another one. I mean, at the moment, as long as the water companies say there's enough infrastructure for the housing, that's all there is. And nobody can really challenge that.
Okay.
And when nobody is looking at that, we're stuck. And he's been told this so many times.
Okay. Now, one of the drivers of the levels of development seems to be directly linked to the population increase, and the population increase is in turn driven probably mostly by the amount of migration, and we've seen unprecedented levels of migration in recent years under a Conservative government. What's your view on that? I mean, is that the problem, or is it simply we just got to live with that level of migration and deal with it?
Well, first of all, I think we need to deal with the causes of population growth. So obviously we're a fairly big country and the population is growing. And a lot of that is not migration. That is just organic growth of the population in the United Kingdom.
But the Office of Statistics say that migration is the primary cause of population.
Migration is certainly one of the large causes. And I'll get to that in a second. I think we also need to just also think, why are we upset about migration or not? And is this something that we should be worried about? In terms of the growth in the population and infrastructure to support it, that is something that we have to be managing. And that's actually an area, as I've just talked about with planning policy, where the government has failed. But let's look at some of the things that have come out today. So in terms of immigration and what the benefits are to the United Kingdom, the health and social care sector is through the floor. And the government's policies on immigration are effectively causing a substantial drop in the numbers of people who are actually applying to come and work in those sectors. And I'm just quickly checking the statistic to make sure I've got it right before I quote it to you today. But there has been a 76% drop in the number of health and social care worker visas that have been issued since the government cracked down on dependents.
Health and social. So this isn't just NHS then?
No, exactly. Now, if you're trying to get a care home place or you're trying to get treatment, migration is one of the pillars that actually is currently supporting our health and adult social care system. So in the one hand, you need to acknowledge that a certain amount of migration is good for the economy, and is actually making sure that some of our services actually function at all. So there is an infrastructure connection that comes from migration. Now, I do think the planning system does need to do more to make sure that we have proper, affordable and social housing and the infrastructure that goes with it. But the answer is not just to prohibit all migration, because the economy clearly relies upon it.
But no one's talking about no one's talking about prohibiting all migration. The fact, I mean, the last.
Actually, Martin, I have to challenge you there. The government continuously use what I would consider to be incredibly dangerous rhetoric about migration.
They keep saying they want to get it down to the tens of thousands, but the last reported figure was 700,000 net net immigration. And the last time I looked, it was some months ago, but the last time I looked at the amount of outstanding vacancies, staff vacancies in the NHS, it was about 150,000. Now, obviously, we need those people for that, but it's out of kilter, isn't it?
Well, all countries have a flow of migration in and out, and it's a fairly organic
Well, that's
process.
true, but I mean, it's
I am
numbers, isn't
genuinely
it?
not. I am genuinely not against migration because I think the economy needs it. And in some cases, the fact that this country has turned into such a hostile place for any migrants is one of the reasons we've got issues in the sort in the sector such as
Okay.
health and social care.
I mean, I'm
And I
surprised.
and I do think the
I
government
don't
needs to
recognize
actually
that,
think about
Paul.
it.
I really don't recognize that this is a hostile place for migrants. I speak to quite a few from different countries. The last one I spoke to was someone from Ukraine who wants to come and work for the Guildford Dragon. I always ask them, you know, how do you find living here? Are people friendly? And she was absolutely enthusiastic that people had welcomed her with open arms. So I'm not sure that there is such a hostile atmosphere, particularly in this part of the world, perhaps.
Well, Martin, I think for a start, there's a little bit of an unfair comparison there. Now, Surrey, and particularly Waverley, has taken in more Ukrainian nationals than I think pretty much anywhere else in the United Kingdom. We're certainly up there. Surrey and Kent are up there in that figure. And when I'm saying a hostile environment, I mean an environment whereby if you want to try and bring dependents or family along with you to work here, it's difficult. If you want to get a visa here and stay and work in certain sectors, it's difficult. If you want to build a life here, in quite a lot of those circumstances, it's difficult. Now, is it a hostile environment compared to a war zone? I suspect the answer is no, which is why I think categorizing this versus the Ukraine is probably unfair and unreasonable, because of course it is not a hostile environment compared to a war zone. But when
No,
you're talking about migration between relatively developed countries, is the UK an attractive place to come and live and work versus other places? And that's before you get to the wages that many of these professions are paid and them keeping pace with any ability to really live in this country. It becomes a hostile environment. And that's before you get to the way the government treats these migrants with their rhetoric. I mean, when the continuous language is stop the boats and migration and migrants are horrendous, why would you want to live in that sort of country? But at the same time, you cannot be sitting there and saying that, you know, we're going to solve all of these problems in the health service if you are being hostile to migrants.
Okay. Well, to be fair, Jeremy Hunt wasn't. He was talking about the advantages of immigration too, and noting that large sectors of the immigration we've seen lately are from Ukraine and Hong Kong, of course. And we see that locally. And as I say, the ones I speak to feel that they are being welcomed here. I can't.
And Martin, may I just say one other thing there as well? This is a classic example, I'm afraid, of Jeremy's rhetoric outside of the House of Commons being very differently to how he acts and votes. So, yes, he might be talking very pleasantly about migration, just as he talks very positively about fighting fracking and drilling in the Surrey Hills. But whenever he gets a chance to actually do something about it in the House of Commons, he either is absent or doesn't vote. I mean, we're going to talk about Thames Water in a minute, which is another area where that happens. We need a member of parliament who is going to actually vote the way they speak. And sewage, as I think we're going to get to in a moment, is another one of those areas.
Okay, so let's move on to Thames Water then. So where do you think it's all gone wrong?
Several things. Jeremy stood up at a meeting I was at a few weeks ago and said that privatisation was a success. Quite a few residents in Godalming heard that. I think many of them were quite sceptical. I take a fairly dim view of how privatisation has worked in this country for one simple reason. By making it a private company for a public service, you are, through shareholder value, taking value and money out of the system whenever you do it. The public good is not put above shareholder value. And money and time and energy is extracted from that equation that should be put back into the system. And in this case, that has resulted in chronic underinvestment for decades in the infrastructure in this country, particularly in water. And what we're seeing now is failures across the board in terms of the ability to supply water, but also the failures to maintain clean and adequate water supply in the systems that they've got. We've got more development that the Thames Water will frequently say there's no issues. And of course, they're the statutory authority on this, so they're allowed to just say it's fine. And so it's difficult to oppose new development on grounds of water supply. And that's before you get to sewage. So every part of Surrey that has rivers and streams that are connected to things with Thames Water have been looking at things like E. coli testing. So even this week, and I do want to use the opportunity to say thank you to Water Rangers for all the work that they do, but they've been doing testing for E. coli in several sections of the river. I was asked to get in contact with them again this week by my colleague in Elsted, Councillor Gemma Long, who'd reported from the Scouts that quite a lot of kids have started to get sick after having been in the river over the previous weekend. Turns out, of course, the E. coli level is above 1,000. That's what the UK considers safe. That, by the way, is 4 times the level that most of Europe and, say, Canada thinks is safe anyway. And you're into the thousands in terms of what they call coliforms per 100 millilitres of water. And so, effectively, this is sewage coming from Thames Water being pumped into rivers and our waterways. Are they doing anything illegal? Well, where they are able to be fined, they factor this in because the fines are so ridiculously low. Where has our MP been on this? Well, they've either voted against doing anything about it directly, as Angela has done over in Guildford, or have been completely absent. I've heard both of them talk about how important it is that water companies do the right thing and are properly regulated. But when the MPs actually get to the position of actually voting for any of these things, where are they? None of them are there. And none of them are doing the right thing. And I am personally getting very frustrated by being lectured by people about how bad some of this is, who are in a position as members of parliament to go and do something about this and repeatedly abrogate that responsibility.
So is nationalisation the answer, do you think?
I think we need to explore it. Certainly at the moment, Thames Water, I think, is probably on the verge of needing to be taken over by the government, even as an emergency measure. I mean, their investors have clearly lost confidence in the company as a whole. And I think they're likely to be one of the first of the big water companies that starts to fall into, because, of course, if they fall into administration, this is a public water company. They're the only one. Water has to be provided safely to residents. So somebody is going to have to step in. So whether the government want to do a planned part or full renationalization of some of these companies or not, I think at some point they're not going to have any choice because they're going to just collapse. And I think a sensible government that is actually thinking about safety and the supply of water and making sure people have access to clean water, both in swimming and in drinking terms, they need to be looking at what these companies are doing. They need to be regulating them properly. They need to be making sure the fines are actually punitive to prevent them doing some of these things just as a cost of doing business. And if need be, they need to be taken back into state control or quasi-state control, depending on what the framework might look like in the future. But I don't think the government are going to get a lot of choice because they're collapsing on their own at the moment.
Okay. Well, now, as far as I understand it, they aren't paying dividends to their shareholders, but they are able to move money into subsidiary companies. Is that true?
I believe so. And just to articulate what I was talking about, value leaving that public system there, shareholder dividends has been the main way that that's happened. But by moving things in and out of different companies, they like other companies, protect those assets. I find it incredibly frustrating that they're allowed to get away with all of the things that they do. I've been told on multiple occasions that there's plenty of money for investment or that they're not on the verge of going bankrupt. And that's because you can cherry pick which companies, subsidiaries of Thames Water you're talking about. You've been there at most of the same meetings as me, Martin, in public, where we've been seeing in the press that Thames Water is in imminent collapse and don't have funding to do this and that. And we're told by their major officers that everything's fine. And both of these two things can't be true at the same time.
And some of these subsidiary companies aren't UK companies, are they? Well, they're not located.
No. And I think here that's where I would, from my own personal point of view here, there are elements such as utility companies which should remain, I think, in UK ownership and UK control, not just because we need to monitor them and regulate them and make sure that they work and are providing the service and are safe, but as a national security element, as far as I'm concerned, they need to be controlled here and have proper regulation.
Okay, thank you. Now, lastly, we're moving on to the most topical of all the subjects, the election, which obviously has just recently been announced. Why do you think the government chose to go, or the Prime Minister chose to go now?
That's one of the questions I've been asked most over the last 24 hours, I have to say. My guess would be that things are only going to get worse, and this is the least bad time. I have to say I'm a little bit frustrated because, of course, with the police and crime commissioner elections only happening at the beginning of May, the whole country has pretty much had its polling stations and its count staff and its election apparatus out there operating. So to only 2 months later have to do it all again at great expense to the public purse is frankly a little frustrating. But honestly, it does sound like he sort of picked the day on a whim. I'm not getting the feeling from even Conservatives that this was something that they were particularly aware of was coming. Certainly, there were a lot of ministers and other MPs away who were recalled at very short notice, and I don't think they were giving a good impression that this was something that was planned. But no, I think he's David Cameron being one. But honestly, I think the reason he's called it is because he's so worried about things getting worse that this is just the least bad time. With the inflation statistics being reasonable from their perspective, and again, I would just repeat that lower inflation is not deflation. But there were other economic metrics that were released that day that were far less pleasant. And the one that I think will be driving some of their thinking is that the cost of borrowing was higher, so that headroom for the Chancellor to do any last-minute tax cuts or salting the earth for a new government, effectively, as a pre-election giveaway, pretty much evaporated overnight. He's now in a position where he can say, well, the Rwanda flights will happen in a few weeks' time if you re-elect me, but the fact they haven't happened yet is obviously is not my fault. He'll be making that kind of thing. Residents here, of course, think that the Rwanda flights and things like that are deeply offensive and lack any compassion at all. And I think it's I used to consider Jeremy a fairly reasonable person, but the fact that he's allied to those sorts of policies has certainly dimmed my own view of him over the last couple of years.
Okay. Now, what about the Lib? I mean, how confident are the Lib Dems locally? Because we're unusually in a position, it seems to me, that the local constituencies here in Surrey are actually marginals between you and the Conservatives. I know that there were majorities last time at the last election, but the ground's changed. If you look at the polling, it seems to have done at least. So Jeremy Hunt was saying he's the underdog. Do you feel that you're the overdog?
I mean, this is an MP, a long-serving MP who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think describing himself as an underdog is probably a little bit of an overstatement. The polls do look fairly reasonable, but polls are just polls. As far as I'm concerned, I have two jobs over the course of the next week. One is to show people the damage that a Conservative-led government, of which Jeremy Hunt has been at the heart of, has damaged this country to the point that change is necessary, and then to show people why I am the positive alternative. And I need to show people what we will deliver, what we will bring, and what we will fix, and what we will change, and why it is important that we bring in that change here soon. We've talked about a handful of issues over just this interview where fundamentally the government has either allowed things to deteriorate beyond repair or have done absolutely nothing to stop it, or have actively aided and abetted it in some cases. I will be showing people what we will do differently and why they should vote for us. And as far as I'm concerned, the only poll that matters is the one on the 4th of July.
Okay. Now, obviously, you have to guard against complacency, but would you at least admit that it is a close fight, and therefore we're likely to see a more intense campaign locally than we're used to?
I think we will see a sort of a more intense campaign. I'm certainly concerned about levels of misinformation, and I'll be calling on Jeremy to fight a clean campaign, to be honest, because it can get aggressive and it can get unpleasant for everybody. And I'm really hopeful that we will have a good debate, but one that doesn't cross certain lines. I think it's going to be an intense campaign, though, and I think there's going to be a lot of focus nationally on some of the seats in Surrey. I think they'll be close, and I think I'll be doing a lot of pacing at the count. Let's just say that when the time comes.
And unlike some campaigns, I don't think the Conservatives will be able to move their people out to other marginal constituency because they have to fight here, won't they?
Well, I mean, at the moment, there do seem to be quite a lot of seats that the Conservatives are getting a little bit worried about, even in Surrey. I mean, certainly Angela Richardson definitely has got a fight on her hands, and I think there are a few other seats in Surrey that are definitely in play.
Yeah,
from my point of view here, Woking, yes, Surrey Heath, even perhaps.
Yeah.
From my perspective, we have a job to do here. I've explained what I'm going to be talking about over the course of the next few weeks, making the positive case for change and reminding people why that change is so necessary, and just offering residents an MP whose values they will know and understand, and whose votes in the House will reflect what he says. That is what I'm offering to the constituents of Godalming and Ash. They will know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and they can trust that what I say is what I will then go and do.
Paul Follows, Lib Dem candidate for I should say Godalming and Ash in the forthcoming election, and also the leader of Waverley Borough Council. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Martin.